Ethan Mercer sat silently at the defense table while his wife dismantled 30 years of their marriage with practiced confidence. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Every sentence landed with calm precision, delivered in the polished tone she used whenever she wanted people to believe she was the only reasonable person in the room. She adjusted the microphone slightly and looked toward the judge instead of Ethan. "My husband was never truly involved," she said. "He earned a paycheck, but beyond that, every important decision rested on my shoulders." She paused just long enough to let the words settle. "I managed our finances, our investments, our home, and eventually my business. He simply trusted me because he preferred not to be bothered." Her attorney nodded approvingly. Across the table, Ethan's lawyer, Michael Harper, quietly slid a yellow legal pad toward him. One sentence was written across the page. "Do you want to respond?" Ethan glanced at it before slowly shaking his head. "No." Judge Eleanor Brooks watched him carefully over the rim of her glasses. She had spent nearly 2 decades in family court and had learned that silence often carried more weight than arguments. Ethan met her eyes for only a moment before looking down again. He had no intention of interrupting. Not yet. To understand why he stayed quiet, you have to understand the life they had built together. He met his future wife, Natalie Carter, at a business seminar in Denver. She was 25, ambitious, charming, and impossible to ignore. Ethan was 30 and preferred listening to talking. Natalie filled every conversation with energy that seemed to brighten every room. Their first date lasted nearly 6 hours. A year later, they married beneath towering oak trees in a small Colorado vineyard surrounded by family and close friends. His father shook his hand after the ceremony. "You chose well." Ethan believed it. Their daughter Emily arrived 2 years later. Their son Ryan followed 18 months after that. Like most young couples, they struggled through mortgages, daycare bills, broken appliances, and sleepless nights. Yet somehow they always found reasons to laugh. When the children were small, Natalie worked part-time before eventually returning to full-time marketing. She excelled. Promotions came quickly. Ethan admired her determination and happily supported every opportunity she earned. His own career demanded constant travel. 4 days every week he boarded airplanes, attended meetings across several states, and rarely returned home before Thursday evening. Whenever he came back, he devoted every available hour to his family. Saturday mornings belonged to the kids. Trips to parks, soccer games, science projects spread across the dining room table, late-night movies with popcorn covering the couch. He tried to make every hour count. Natalie handled everything else. She organized appointments, paid bills, scheduled contractors, managed insurance paperwork, balanced bank accounts. Whenever Ethan thanked her, she smiled. "I've got it." Eventually, those words became routine. "I've got it." She handled every financial decision, every investment, every tax document, every retirement account, every password. Ethan never questioned it. He believed trust meant stepping aside when someone proved more capable. Years later, he would realize trust without verification slowly becomes blindness. His mother, Margaret Mercer, lived alone outside Cincinnati after Ethan's father passed away. She remained fiercely independent despite approaching 80. She maintained a flower garden, baked every Sunday, and refused help unless absolutely necessary. Natalie insisted on visiting her every Wednesday. "I don't want her feeling lonely." Margaret adored her daughter-in-law. More than once she told Ethan, "She's the daughter I always wished I'd had." Those words warmed him every time. Then little things began disappearing. An antique clock, a silver tea set, old jewelry that had belonged to Ethan's grandmother. Natalie always had an explanation. They're in storage. I had them cleaned. I moved them somewhere safer. Each answer sounded perfectly reasonable. Margaret accepted them. So did Ethan. Months became years. Then something unexpected happened. One Tuesday afternoon, Ethan answered his cell phone while working from home. The caller introduced herself as an employee from Margaret's bank. She believed she was speaking with Natalie. I just need to verify yesterday's transfer before we process the remaining amount. Ethan frowned. What transfer? Silence. Professional, uncomfortable silence. The woman apologized immediately. I'm sorry. I thought this was Mrs. Mercer. Ethan remained polite. I'm Margaret Mercer's son. Could you explain what transfer you're referring to? Another pause. I believe you should visit the branch. The call ended. Ethan sat motionless. His instincts, dormant since retirement, awakened instantly. For 23 years he had investigated financial fraud for the federal government. His work had taught him one lesson above every other. Never accuse, never assume. Collect evidence first, ask questions later. That evening he said nothing to Natalie. Instead, he opened a fresh notebook, wrote the date across the top of the first page, and began documenting everything. For the first time in 30 years, he stopped trusting. He started investigating. The next morning, Ethan drove to the bank before sunrise. He arrived 10 minutes before the branch opened and waited in his truck with a cup of black coffee growing cold in his hands. Years of investigative work had taught him patience. Important conversations usually began after the waiting ended. When the doors unlocked, the branch manager greeted him with cautious professionalism. My name is Ethan Mercer, he said, placing his driver's license on the desk. I'm Margaret Mercer's son. I received a phone call yesterday regarding a transfer from her account. The manager hesitated. I'm not sure how much I'm permitted to discuss. I understand, Ethan replied calmly. But my mother is 83 years old, and someone from your office believed they were speaking with my wife about one of her transactions. I need to know why. After reviewing identification and confirming Ethan's relationship to the account holder, the manager slowly opened several records. The first transfer was nearly $20,000. The second had occurred only 6 weeks earlier. Then another and another. Each transaction carried authorization under a valid power of attorney signed by Margaret 3 years before. The authorized representative was Natalie Mercer. Ethan thanked the manager without showing emotion. Inside, however, a cold weight settled across his chest. He drove directly to his mother's house. Margaret answered the door wearing gardening gloves despite the chilly morning. Ethan, I wasn't expecting you. I know. She smiled and invited him inside. Over tea, he asked gentle questions instead of direct accusations. Mom, do you remember signing paperwork that allowed Natalie to help with your banking? Margaret nodded. Of course, she said it would make grocery shopping and paying bills easier. Did you approve these transfers? She looked confused. What transfers? He slid copies of the statements across the table. Margaret adjusted her reading glasses. The smile disappeared from her face. I don't remember these. Tears filled her eyes. I thought she was helping me. Ethan reached across the table and held her hand. You've done nothing wrong. I'm so embarrassed. You have nothing to be embarrassed about. She looked at him quietly. Will you handle this? I promise. That promise became his only priority. Over the next 4 months, Ethan worked with the same discipline that had defined his career. He never confronted Natalie. He never hinted that anything had changed. Instead, he documented everything. Using contacts developed during decades of federal investigations and his new consulting position with a respected litigation firm, He legally obtained financial records, property histories, corporate filings, and public business registrations. Every document revealed another layer. Natalie had quietly established a marketing consultancy almost 7 years earlier. He had known she freelanced occasionally. He hadn't known she operated a profitable company. He hadn't known portions of the startup capital had come directly from their joint investment accounts. He hadn't known several payments listed as client revenue appeared unsupported by completed contracts. The pattern disturbed him. Then came the estate records. His parents' antique grandfather clock had been sold through an auction house in Kentucky. His grandmother's diamond necklace had been appraised and purchased by a private collector. Several rare paintings disappeared through an estate liquidation company under Margaret's authorization. Authorization she insisted she never knowingly gave. One evening, Ethan opened a storage facility report linked to an address he didn't recognize. Inside were photographs, boxes labeled estate, furniture from his parents' home, family heirlooms, items Natalie had claimed were donated years ago. He stared at the screen for several minutes, not because of their financial value, because every piece represented a memory. His father's favorite leather chair, his mother's wedding in China, the brass lamp that had illuminated countless Christmas dinners. Pieces of an entire lifetime had quietly vanished. Yet Ethan remained silent. Natalie noticed nothing unusual. She continued discussing work over dinner. She talked about future investments, weekend trips, retirement plans. She kissed him goodbye every morning exactly as she always had. Sometimes Ethan wondered whether she believed her own version of reality. Then in early March, everything shifted. Natalie filed for divorce. The petition arrived by certified mail. It was comprehensive, aggressive, painfully personal. According to the filing, Ethan had been emotionally unavailable throughout most of the marriage. He had ignored financial responsibilities. He contributed little beyond his paycheck. Natalie claimed nearly every meaningful asset should remain hers because she alone had built their financial future. The requested settlement was devastating. She sought the family home, most investment accounts, her business, several retirement funds, even portions of Ethan's pension. Michael Harper read every page twice before looking up. "This is one of the boldest divorce petitions I've ever seen." Ethan quietly placed 2 thick binders on Michael's desk. "I thought you might want these." Michael opened the first binder. Bank records, transfer histories, property sales, business registrations, photographs, financial charts, every page carefully indexed. He spent nearly 20 minutes turning pages without speaking. Finally, he leaned back. "How long have you been gathering this?" 4 months. "And she has no idea?" "No." Michael slowly closed the binder. "I've represented people in difficult divorces for almost 30 years. He tapped the cover lightly. "I've never had a client walk into my office this prepared." Ethan simply nodded. Years of investigations had taught him something most people never learned. Facts speak louder when they're introduced at exactly the right moment. So they waited, and Ethan said nothing. The waiting became the hardest part. Ethan had spent most of his adult life gathering evidence before taking action, but this case felt different. It wasn't about strangers hiding money through shell companies or executives falsifying records. Every document in the binders carried the weight of his own life. Each page reminded him that the woman he had trusted for 3 decades had been living a second financial life. His daughter Emily called first. Her voice was careful. "Dad, Mom told me about the divorce. I figured she would. She said you've been distant for years." Ethan stared through the kitchen window into the backyard where he had once pushed Emily on a swing until sunset. "I'm sorry you have to hear any of this." There was a pause. "I just want to know what happened." "You will. When? When everything is finished. She sounded disappointed, but she accepted the answer. I love you, Dad. I love you too. A week later, Ryan called. Unlike his sister, he didn't soften his words. You should have paid more attention. I know. Grandma told me she was confused about her finances months ago. I know. So why didn't you do something sooner? Ethan closed his eyes. Because I didn't realize how much had already happened. Ryan sighed heavily. I don't know what to believe anymore. You don't have to decide today. The call ended politely, but the distance between them felt greater than ever. Ethan never blamed either of his children. They had only heard one version of the story. Soon, they would hear the rest. The evening before the first court hearing, Ethan sat alone in the family kitchen. The room felt strangely empty. Photographs still covered the walls. Emily's graduation, Ryan's baseball championship, family vacations, Christmas mornings, 30 years captured inside wooden frames. He poured himself a cup of coffee and allowed the silence to settle around him. For 1 hour, he let himself feel everything he had been suppressing. The disappointment, the betrayal, the sadness of realizing that memories could remain genuine even when the person inside them had changed. Then he stood, washed the mug, pressed his gray suit and went to bed. He slept surprisingly well. The next morning he arrived at the courthouse 15 minutes early. Michael Harper was already waiting outside the courtroom. You ready? Ethan smiled faintly. As ready as anyone can be. Natalie entered a few minutes later with her attorney, Victor Lawson. Victor carried himself with effortless confidence. His tailored suit, polished shoes, and neatly folded pocket square projected the image of a lawyer accustomed to winning. He barely acknowledged Ethan. The court began promptly at 9. Judge Eleanor Brooks entered the courtroom, greeted both attorneys, and reviewed the case file before inviting Victor to begin. He rose confidently. Your Honor, this is an unfortunate case involving a wife who carried nearly every meaningful responsibility throughout a 30-year marriage. He walked slowly before the bench. My client managed the household, supervised investments, built a successful consulting business, organized family finances, cared for the children, and even looked after her elderly mother-in-law. He paused dramatically. Meanwhile, Mr. Mercer remained largely uninvolved in the family's financial life. Victor spoke with remarkable confidence. Every sentence painted Ethan as a passive observer who simply collected a paycheck while his wife built everything around him. Then Natalie took the witness stand. She appeared calm, almost sympathetic. I tried for years to include Ethan, she testified. He always told me to handle everything. Were you responsible for managing the family's finances? Yes. The investments? Yes. The household? Yes. Your business? I built it from the ground up. Victor nodded approvingly. What role did your husband play? Natalie looked toward Ethan for the first time that morning. He was physically present. She paused. But being present isn't the same as contributing. The courtroom became very quiet. Victor continued. Would you describe your husband as financially knowledgeable? She shook her head. Not really. He trusted me completely. Michael Harper remained seated. He didn't object. He didn't interrupt. He simply made a short note on his legal pad. Judge Brooks watched everyone carefully before turning toward Michael. Counselor, Michael stood. No questions for the witness at this time, Your Honor. Victor looked mildly surprised. Natalie looked relieved. Judge Brooks glanced down at the thick stack of documents Michael had submitted that morning before court. She slowly adjusted her reading glasses. Then she looked directly at Ethan. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. It was the look of someone who had just connected several important pieces of a puzzle. She turned back toward Victor Lawson. "Counsel," she said evenly, "before we proceed any further, I have a few questions regarding the financial disclosures and supporting documents that were filed this morning." Victor smiled confidently. "Of course, Your Honor." Judge Brooks rested one hand on the file. "Good." Her voice remained calm. "Because I believe this case may be considerably different from the one you've just described." The courtroom fell completely silent. Not a single person spoke. Judge Eleanor Brooks slowly closed the file in front of her, removed her reading glasses, and looked first at Victor Lawson, then at Natalie, and finally at Ethan. She folded her hands. "Mr. Lawson," she said calmly, "before this hearing began, opposing counsel submitted several hundred pages of financial records, property documents, banking histories, business filings, and supporting evidence." Victor nodded confidently. "Yes, Your Honor. I've spent the last several hours reviewing the material." His smile remained. "For that reason," the judge continued, "I'd like to clarify a few statements your client made under oath." Victor's expression stiffened slightly. Judge Brooks looked toward Natalie. "Mrs. Mercer, you testified that your husband has very little financial knowledge." "Yes." "You also testified that he left every meaningful financial decision to you." "That's correct." The judge looked back at the documents. "Are you familiar with your husband's professional background?" Natalie frowned. "He worked for the federal government before retiring." "Only that?" "Yes." Judge Brooks raised one eyebrow. "Interesting." She turned another page. "According to official employment records submitted to this court, Mr. Ethan Mercer served 23 years as a senior federal investigator specializing in financial fraud, corporate embezzlement, and forensic accounting." Victor's pen stopped moving. The courtroom remained silent. Judge Brooks continued. "He later accepted a consulting position with one of the state's most respected financial litigation firms, where he continues to analyze complex fraud investigations." She looked directly at Victor. "Would you describe that as someone possessing minimal financial awareness?" Victor hesitated. "No." "Your Honor." Natalie's face lost its color. For the first time that morning, she looked genuinely frightened. Judge Brooks wasn't finished. She opened another binder. "These records also indicate approximately $68,000 were transferred from Mr. Mercer's elderly mother's accounts over a 3-year period." She paused. "Every transfer was authorized using a power of attorney naming Mrs. Mercer." Natalie's breathing became noticeably heavier. Victor leaned toward her and whispered something urgently. She didn't answer. Judge Brooks continued reading. "In addition, multiple antiques, jewelry collections, family heirlooms, and artwork belonging to Margaret Mercer were sold through estate dealers and private auctions." She lifted several photographs. "The proceeds from many of those sales appear to have entered accounts connected to Mrs. Mercer's consulting company." The room became perfectly still. Michael Harper quietly stood. "Your Honor, additional tracing documents are included in Exhibit 27. "I've reviewed them," Judge Brooks replied. Victor slowly stood. "Your Honor, I believe my client would appreciate a brief recess." The judge looked at him steadily. "I believe she would." She struck the gavel lightly. 15 minutes. Everyone rose. Natalie remained seated for several seconds before Victor gently touched her shoulder. She finally stood. As they walked into the hallway, Victor immediately began speaking in a low, urgent voice. Natalie stared at the floor without responding. Across the corridor, Michael handed Ethan a paper cup of coffee from the vending machine. Neither man spoke for almost a minute. Finally, Michael smiled. "You knew exactly what she was going to do." I suspected. You let her file first. Yes. You let her tell the story she wanted the court to hear. Ethan nodded. People usually reveal the most when they believe no one can challenge them. Michael laughed quietly. That's the investigator talking. It's an experience. Michael took a sip of coffee. I've handled hundreds of divorces. He shook his head. I've never seen someone prepare a case this thoroughly. Ethan looked toward the courtroom doors. I didn't prepare to win. Michael looked at him. I prepared to tell the truth. When the court resumed, Victor's confidence had disappeared. He stood slowly. Your Honor, after consulting with my client, we respectfully request a continuance to review the recently submitted financial evidence. Judge Brooks considered the request. Granted. She paused deliberately. However, I want the record to reflect that the documents before this court raise issues extending well beyond the ordinary division of marital property. Her eyes settled on Natalie. I strongly recommend that all parties carefully review their legal positions before this matter returns. The meaning was unmistakable. This was no longer just a divorce case. Potential civil and criminal consequences had entered the conversation. Victor quietly gathered his files. His movements no longer carried the confidence he had displayed earlier that morning. Natalie avoided looking at Ethan. As she walked out of the courtroom, her shoulders were slumped and her face remained pale. For 30 years she had believed Ethan's silence meant ignorance. Now she understood she had mistaken patience for weakness. Outside the courthouse, Ethan stood on the steps and watched the gray clouds drift across the afternoon sky. His phone rang. It was his mother. How did it go? Margaret asked softly. Ethan smiled for the first time in weeks. It went exactly the way it needed to. She exhaled with relief. I've been praying for that. I'll see you Sunday. I'll make your favorite pot roast. I'd like that. After ending the call, Ethan slipped the phone into his pocket. The hardest part wasn't exposing the truth. The hardest part had been waiting long enough for the truth to expose itself. 3 weeks after the hearing, Michael Harper called Ethan just after breakfast. I've received a revised settlement proposal, he said. Ethan leaned back in his chair. I'm listening. Michael let out a quiet laugh. You won't recognize it. The first proposal Natalie had filed demanded nearly everything. The second surrendered almost everything. The family home would remain with Ethan. His retirement accounts and pension would stay untouched. Every dollar taken from Margaret Mercer's accounts would be repaid in full, along with interest. Natalie also agreed to return proceeds from the estate sales and transfer additional personal assets to cover the remaining losses. Any disputed business funds would be resolved separately through financial mediation. There would be no public trial, no dramatic courtroom battle, no attempt to challenge the evidence, only signatures, deadlines, and the quiet end of a marriage that had lasted 3 decades. Michael closed the folder. She's no longer trying to win. No, Ethan replied calmly. She's trying to limit the damage. The divorce became official 6 weeks later. Neither of them spoke during the final hearing. The judge reviewed the agreement, asked a handful of routine questions, and signed the order. Just like that, 30 years together became a matter of paperwork. Outside the courthouse, Ethan walked to his truck without looking back. There was nothing left to say. A few days later, Emily called. Her voice was different this time, soft, humble. Dad, Mom finally told me the truth. Ethan remained quiet. I didn't know about Grandma's money. I know. I believed everything she said. I know, she began crying. I'm so sorry. Ethan looked out at the maple tree in his front yard, its autumn leaves drifting slowly across the lawn. You don't owe me a lifetime of guilt, he said gently, but I judged you. You judged the information you had. I should have asked you. You asked now. There was a long silence. I love you, Dad. I never doubted that. When the call ended, Ethan sat quietly for several minutes before returning to his book. Some wounds healed through conversations. Others simply became easier to carry. Ryan visited the following Saturday with his wife and 2 young children. The grandchildren raced through the backyard, laughing as they chased each other through piles of freshly raked leaves. For the first time in months, the house sounded alive again. As the family prepared to leave, Ryan paused beside his truck. I've been thinking. Ethan waited. I spent weeks blaming you. You did? I was wrong. Ethan smiled faintly. You were protecting your mother. Ryan nodded. I should have protected you too. You were never supposed to choose. Ryan stepped forward and hugged his father. It was brief, awkward, completely sincere. That single embrace repaired more than either man could explain. Life slowly settled into a new rhythm. Every other Sunday, Ethan drove to Margaret's house. Her vegetable garden was gone now, replaced by flower pots that required less work, but she still insisted on making lunch herself. One afternoon, she pointed toward the living room. The old brass lamp is back. Ethan smiled. Investigators had located it inside a rented storage unit registered under a business address connected to Natalie. Several family photographs, a hand-crafted rocking chair, his father's fishing tackle. A few treasured keepsakes had also been recovered. Many other heirlooms were gone forever. Margaret simply shrugged. They're only things. Ethan knew she was right. The memories had never been stored in the objects themselves. They lived in the people who remembered them. At 63, Ethan found peace in ordinary routines, morning walks through the neighborhood, reading on the back porch with a cup of coffee, consulting 2 days each week with attorneys investigating financial fraud, helping families uncover truths hidden behind complicated paperwork. The work suited him. One afternoon, Michael stopped by the office carrying 2 coffees. You know, he said with a grin, Judge Brooks mentioned your case during a legal seminar. Ethan raised an eyebrow. What did she say? Michael smiled. She said it reminded everyone in the courtroom that silence should never be mistaken for ignorance. Ethan looked through the office window for a long moment. People often assumed the loudest voice carried the greatest truth. His marriage had proved otherwise. Natalie believed confidence would outweigh evidence. She believed that because Ethan rarely defended himself, he wouldn't know how. She mistook patience for weakness. She mistook trust for blindness. Most of all, she mistook silence for absence. She never realized that while she was writing her version of their marriage, Ethan had quietly been documenting the facts. Not out of revenge, not out of pride, but because the truth deserved its chance to speak. When that chance finally arrived, he didn't celebrate. He didn't argue. He didn't say, I warned you. He simply accepted the judge's decision, drove home, hung his suit in the closet, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and sat on his back porch as the evening sun disappeared beyond the trees. After 30 years of being underestimated, he discovered something worth carrying into the rest of his life. The strongest case is rarely built by the person who speaks the most. It's built by the person who waits until every fact can speak for itself.